He was a local prosecutor here?
Well, what he was born here, well, born just over the border, raised here, never went to college, never graduated from law school.
Amazing.
He read for the law and became an answer to the Jeopardy question, and the only person in the history of the United States to be a Solicitor General, Attorney General, and a Justice of the Supreme Court. And of course, by the way, he was Chief American Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial. So, and he died at 62. So you think about it, he put all of that into...
Pretty short time frame.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, so it's been fascinating on all those fronts. Anyways, welcome to Chautauqua. What did David tell you this place and event was like?
Well, actually, he didn't.
Okay.
You know, I was contacted by Andrew Cayley.
Okay, perfect.
And Andrew asked me to consider coming here. So I did.
So you turn on his British charm and here you are.
Well, Andrew's an old friend of mine. He and I prosecuted 2 cases together.
Yeah.
So I knew Andrew from the ICTY.
Was your dad a lawyer? Was anybody in your family lawyers?
No. My twin brother was trained as a lawyer and never practiced law.
Where's hometown?
San Mateo, California.
So was there an inspiration? Kind of like one day you just decided to go from college to law school? And
No, not particularly. I was a child of the 60s.
Uh-huh.
And so there were, the Vietnam War was going on, and, one had drastic choices to make at that time, and I had no choice because I was drafted, but to go, into the service, and quite miraculously, quite astonishingly, I got a deferral, as a result of an old sporting injury, and then I didn't know what to do, so I eventually went to law school.
where?
Hastings.
Hastings?
Yeah.
California.
University of California at Hastings. There's in San Francisco is what it is.
Growing up, were you a San Francisco Giants person? Were you
Of course I
Willie
was.
McCovey?
Of course
Willie
I
Mays?
was. Of course I was.
Did you even?
All those guys. They were the center of the universe.
Well, my biggest hero was Juan Marichal.
Juan Marichal, when he attacked Johnny Roseborough. He'll be remembered for that. Mine was Willie Mays.
But, well, nobody quite like him. And did you follow the 49ers as well? Was that part of your
of course I did.
John Brody and...
John Brody, Y.A. Tittle,
Yep.
long before, just before Brody. Of course, Joe Montana, Steve Young.
Those glory years.
Those are the glory years. Bill Walsh.
Yeah. And the world of international law. Here you are, somehow you end up in a world of which not many people play in. Was that by design or just...
By chance.
Serendipity?
It was serendipity. I mentioned yesterday at the conference that my old friend Alan Teeger had been involved in a major case, and he and I go back to public defender days in California. He was at the Department of Justice with me. We were both prosecutors in the same criminal section, although I had moved from the civil rights criminal section to the environmental crime section. And I saw Alan on the street. I asked him what he was doing. He told me about the tribunal in The Hague, and that the Department of Justice had solicited for people who were interested in going, and that he had applied and been accepted. And I said to him, "Gee, I think I'm going to apply." He said it was too late. And I said I'd never heard of the solicitation process, but I decided that since it was a dream job for me, that I would pursue the matter further. So I contacted the Deputy Prosecutor, Graham Blewett, at the ICTY. I picked up the phone and called him. I asked him if he was going to still hire prosecutors. He said he was, but I needed to submit a resume by the next day, which I didn't have, and which I prepared that night, and I submitted it, and I was hired.
That's good. That's a good, quick turnaround,
Yeah.
Don't you like that? You were, Santa Clara, you were both in the prosecutor as well as at some point, you were also a public defender.
Yes, I was a public defender in the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office in California. And then an old friend of mine who had been an intern in my office, who is now a very successful criminal civil rights prosecutor, called me, and she asked me if I'd be interested in applying to the Department of Justice. I said yes, I would, and I applied, and I was accepted.
Did you feel that from a young lawyers, and of which there's a boatload of law students here,
I noticed.
which is great.
That's great. They're the future.
Yeah, exactly. That having both sides of just the advocacy, where you got the public defender side, you got the... Is that a good track? I mean, I know that's available for younger attorneys, but is that something you'd recommend?
Absolutely. I think if ultimately you want to be a prosecutor, then you have to know how to defend cases, because you have to be able to anticipate defenses and how to counter defenses. And, you know, I think it's essential training. I also thought in my career, with my career experience, that being a young public defender was more challenging than being a young prosecutor. Being a young prosecutor, you try pretty simple cases, drunk driving cases, you know, petty theft cases. And in my county, where I practice, Santa Clara County, the police officers would go to the young prosecutors and say, you call these 5 witnesses. And there was no imagination or creative thinking. And whereas if you're a public defender, then, you know, first of all, generally you don't have much evidence. Mm-hmm. And you have to think very hard and be very clever in trying to figure out where is any possible doubt in this case, and be ready to, you know, take on the case. I also think that, you know, you have lots of other challenges as a young public defender. I mean, as a public defender, whether you're young or you're old. The judges don't generally like you. Your clients don't like you in large measure. The police don't like you. The prosecutors don't like you, and sometimes the jurors don't like you, depending on the, you know, the type of crime that your client is accused of committing. So it's a challenge, and from that point of view, I think the development process for young lawyers is much faster.
Last night, one of the questions that I wanted to ask, but time sort of got away from us, was that in what you did is serious business. I mean, it's serious crimes, serious violations, and the victims, it's a serious cause. But at some point, as you pause, and I wanted to ask it so badly last night, was there a little levity? Was there a moments in time in the prosecutorial where you simply pause and say, you know, let me tell you about this story. And I got to believe, and I asked Serge later on, you know, about that, and he goes, that would have been a good question. We all would have had to pause, ponder, but we would have come up with a story. Would that have been a fair question to ask even last night?
Well, it certainly would have been a fair question, and you should have asked it. I would have been very interested in the answers. You know, it's a grim job. It's a very intense job, and I think, you know, we come from privileged backgrounds, living in the United States. You know, we don't have, our villages haven't been burned to the ground, our families haven't been massacred, you know, our whole universe hasn't been destroyed. That was the daily bread that we had to deal with. And so coming from a very comfortable, privileged background that we all did in the Department of Justice in the United States, you know, it was a shock, at least to me, to my system, and I know it was a shock to my colleagues and to many people who were entering into that dark world, and to make sure that people remained balanced and didn't have, you know, situational stress problems and the like. Mm-hmm. The ICTY had professional help on hand. I never used it, you know, but that's not to say I was not chronically stressed when it came to dealing with these stories that were exceptionally difficult to hear and to absorb and to try to understand. I mean, we're all human, and you listen to these tragic human tales, and you can't help but be moved and after a while, the steady drumbeat of that can have an effect on people. And you know, I've seen it in my colleagues. I've seen some of them, you know, have had their lives seriously affected by the substance of what we do. We're not dealing with contracts, you know.
Right.
We're not dealing with commercial transactions. We're dealing with the darkest of the human, you know, crimes, and it's tough to deal with.
Well, that goes to the point of how do you keep your sense of humor and maintain that balance.
Well, you know, you do have, you try to find releases, and you try to find, you know, I was a fly fisherman. I'm a trout fisherman. And so, you know, I discovered about 3 years into my stay in The Hague that there was some spectacular trout fishing nearby. I never thought that. I never suspected it. But my friend Pete McCloskey and I, Pete was one of the prosecutors in the Srebrenica massacres with me, and he continued to prosecute all the Srebrenica cases have been prosecuted by him. Well, he's an old pal of mine from California days, and we found our release by going fly fishing.
Wonderful. You were there in, what, 1993?
94.
94. So Richard had not quite been there yet.
Correct.
So you would have been there during the tenure of the placeholder, if you will, the Venezuelan.
No, I wasn't there when he was there. He was there for too short a period of time. I arrived when Graham Blewett was the acting prosecutor. Graham was a former prosecutor from Australia. He was the deputy, eventually was the deputy prosecutor.
Was there somebody telling me last night, maybe even you, about whether or not one of the big questions was, could he sign an indictment? You know, as a deputy prosecutor.
Well, I never addressed that problem, and I don't know. I was unaware of that, frankly.
Maybe it was Andrew. I forget how it came up. And then you had Richard for a couple of years, and then he recommended Louise Arbor, and then she was followed by Carla, and then Serge.
Correct.
Were you there when Serge came up?
Yes.
I get the sense that you're a staffer. I mean, you're a life guy. This is like in the government. You have all those folks who are there, Department of Justice folks, and all of a sudden the top guys change all the time. Is that tough on the staff? Goldstone, Arbor, Del Ponte, Bramert, they are different, all different personalities, just by design.
Well, it wasn't difficult for me.
Okay.
And each of the prosecutors had made different types of contributions. From a trial point of view, I was a trial lawyer. You know, I was happy to be doing my job and not have interference in my cases. And none of the prosecutors interfered with any of my cases. So I was perfectly happy. Whoever was running the political interference, that was a necessary job, and it was something that I wasn't involved in, except at the very earliest stages was I involved in the politics in some small way. But, you know, they were very helpful in terms of making conditions in which my prosecution teams could thrive.
Mm-hmm. What is the prosecution teams? I've never really drilled down as you had a team and you were the prosecutor, senior trial prosecutor, and as a case is assigned and you have a case, what's the grouping consist of?
Well, I was the senior lawyer in all of my trials. It consisted of, sometimes there was a co-senior lawyer, that happened once, and sometimes, and thereafter, then there were subordinate lawyers, and there were investigators, and there were case managers, there were experts that we could draw on. We had sections in the institution that had expertise, military experts, political experts. We had to know that material. We had to be able to lead that evidence. And so while they weren't specifically assigned to my teams, they were a resource from which I could draw, you know, expertise. But the teams depended on the size of the case and the importance of the case. Bigger cases had bigger teams. You know, smaller cases had smaller teams. And of course, toward the end of my tenure there, I prosecuted a man by the name of General Perisic. And we had a very small team. You know, he was a very important figure, but the staffing was pretty diminished by the time Perisic was prosecuted.
Did it impact you, well, back to the politics of the prosecutor, in one sense, it's funding. Funding. You know, frankly, all the chief prosecutors who I've interviewed over the last 9 years, that's a major component of their job. Does that leak itself down to how you staff and the number of people you have for a case?
Of course it does. Funding is a critical element. You know, one can do cases with, you know, as many assets as possible, and it's a luxury. I've been involved in one case, one prosecution for the government, U.S. government, where money was no object, and I could have whatever I wanted. And my team, you know, I was not the lead lawyer in that case, but we had whatever we wanted at our fingertips. I've been on the other extreme, where there are insufficient assets, insufficient human resources, and you have to prioritize. You could say, for example, I said oftentimes in this investigation, I would like to do the following. And then, because of a lack of resources, I would say, I can't do that. So how can I resolve that, you know, that issue? And, you know, you have to develop compromises. So yes, resources are hugely important, and the funding model for tribunals, the ICTY had a stable funding model. You know, I was, as you know, I have been, I just recently retired, the international co-investigating judge for the Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and there are no funds. And funds are a critical issue every year. Mm-hmm. And with no funds or hiring freezes, you know, it's tough to manage an investigation. So yeah, funding is hugely important.
As you look back during your 17 years with the ICTY and the 4 chief prosecutors, can you reflect on their skill sets, distinguishing the skill sets that one perhaps has different than the other, and how that might impact just the trial and how it was perceived by the public? Like Goldstone obviously was there at the beginning and with a two-year stay, and so his was, you know, you're starting. It's a starter.
Well, I would, my general impressions, formed having worked under all of them in the broadest sense, mm-hmm. is Judge Goldstone was absolutely essential to our survival. He was an astute political player. He understood the issues of management of a new tribunal and funding, and he was quite adroit at running the political interference, and I consider one of his greatest contributions was that we managed to survive for 2 years under, you know, at all. Mm-hmm. Louise Arbour was his replacement. I think she was a brilliant lawyer. I think she was she was a very humane person. She was very smart, and she was very courageous. And she developed and had no hesitation in making sure that we would use our full authority in terms of what we were entitled to use. I'll give you an example. It turned around an issue, I mentioned it yesterday. There was a regime where states had an international obligation to comply with requests from the tribunal. That was a legal responsibility. And when it came to cooperation with states that were complicit in the crimes, of course you could anticipate that there would be no cooperation. In the case that I was prosecuting, that I took to Louise, which was in the Blaskic case, Croatia was not cooperating with my request for assistance. I was trying to establish their involvement in the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina in order to establish that grave breaches of the Geneva Convention had been been committed. And so finally, in complete frustration, Croatia would say, we're still looking for the documents. Yes, you'll get them in due course. You know, that we were being slow-rolled. And I then drafted a subpoena ducis tecum. I took that subpoena ducis tecum to Louise, and I said to her, because I didn't want to surprise her, I'd like to file this. And she, without any hesitation, said, we're entitled to do it, file it. Mm-hmm. And we filed it, and we had enormous litigation on that. So that was, Louise was somebody who was very robust in asserting our rights and our, our authority. Then Carla came. Carla was, my perception is, her greatest contribution was she was a bulldog when it came to going after the fugitives. She pursued them relentlessly and fearlessly, and as a result, during her tenure, I think we had huge success in terms of capturing fugitives. And Serge came at the end of my tenure. So Serge's contribution, he was exquisite when it came to managing the political side of the equation. He's a very nice fellow, as you know, and when he came, I said to him, I saw him right at the beginning of his tenure, I said, I have no doubt that Karadzic and Mladic will be arrested during your tenure, and you should make sure that those cases are ready to proceed. I had those cases. Frankly, I had the responsibility of those cases, but they languished because I was constantly in trial, and I had other responsibilities and couldn't pay attention to them. And then I was entering my last trial, so I could see the handwriting on the wall. So Serge picked up the challenge right away, and they were properly staffed, and I think they will be very successful prosecutions.
Milosevic, for those I certainly remember, but as time goes on, because of his death, that story is going to get relegated to kind of the back burner. And maybe for the camera, because this was an educational opportunity, Milosevic being the president, being the guy who signed the accord in Dayton, but there was at some point where he became a war criminal and then subsequently arrested. Could you tell that story?
Well, I don't know the story very well, so I won't do it justice.
Okay.
I was not involved in the Milosevic case, although it was swirling around me. I don't want to give you a false story or an inaccurate story. But it was very important, obviously, that he was arrested.
Do you remember much about that time? Was there a conversation in the office about, hey, we might have somebody's got the political clout, the political will that we could actually get it?
I was so heavily involved in my trials that I did not engage in many of those discussions at that level.
Yeah.
I just didn't. Obviously, arresting fugitives was hugely important, and one of the problems that was mentioned today, and of which I'm acutely aware, is we do not have the authority to. We don't have our own police force. We can't go out and arrest people. As a result of that, the life of the tribunal, in my view, was expanded because there have been multiple Srebrenica trials on the same facts, repeated, in all because people are arrested at different times. There were indictments with multiple defendants, but you could only, it turned out that only one had been arrested, and so you had to start that trial because somebody who's accused of indicted has a right to a trial without undue delay. And so you'd have to start that trial, and then subsequently another one would be arrested, and you'd have to start that trial. So seriatim, you can trace, I think, part of the length of the tribunal to how long it took to get these people arrested.
Well, clearly with Karadzic and Mladic, that was as it was, things were winding down, and they actually had a set date, I think, in 2010, where you're going to wind this down, and we're going to have these two guys that are out there, and all of a sudden, 2008 they get Karadzic, and 2011 Mladic, and now you got to, because they were indicted.
Well, it's very interesting. You know, I was involved in drafting the Karadzic and Mladic indictments. I conducted the Rule 61 hearings with Karadzic and Mladic, and I shudder to think what would have happened had they turned themselves in right after the Rule 61 hearings, because time turned out to be our ally. You know, they were digging their own graves by remaining fugitives. We collected more evidence. We had people who, you know, we developed additional witnesses. We developed additional linkage to those crimes. You know, the Rule 61 hearings, the standard was pretty low.
By the way, for the camera, what was that?
Rule 61 hearings were a procedural mechanism by which judges reviewed whether there was sufficient evidence to issue an international arrest warrant. In fact, you know, there's a lot of pressure in international tribunals because there's an expectation, in a very frankly an unrealistic expectation, that by people who sponsor the tribunals, that these investigations are easy and can be quickly done. And you know, there's impatience by the sponsors of these tribunals. And so it was a clever way, in my view, to put some numbers on the board to show that something was being done. And so they had these Rule 61 hearings, which, you know, demonstrated that we had done something. And very frankly, you know, and when you think about it in a theoretical point of view, from a prosecutorial point of view, a Rule 61 hearing where you're going to publicly air all of the evidence, and therefore you don't have to air all your evidence, where you're going to air your evidence, essentially give the fugitives a blueprint on what you've got and the identity of these witnesses, is a terrible idea.
Right.
And so we were confronted with, obviously we were needed to put on a Rule 61 hearing, but so we resorted to essentially finding information that was in the public domain and introducing that. So,
Karadzic is arrested in 2008. Were you there then?
yes, of course. I was there till 2018. I'm sorry, 2010. I'm sorry,
Okay.
2010.
So Karadzic, were you curious as hell to what this guy looked like?
Well, I knew what he looked like. I didn't quite recognize him with his disguise.
Yeah, when he came in
It
the
was
court.
great.
When he came into court.
It was great, yeah. I was curious.
Yeah. What a look.
He looked just like he did once he got cleaned up and shaved. He looked like Karadzic that we all knew.
He's out of curiosity because he walks in with his beard and looks like a yoga master. Did he have to shave? Was he ordered to shave?
I have no idea.
I'm just curious because all of a sudden they had the
Oh yeah,
right.
it was a great disguise.
Yeah. I know that other prosecutors, sometimes you read about, you visit, you see the pictures, you see all this stuff, you see it on TV, but at some point there they are in person. There's this kind of, the Nuremberg prosecutors, and they met Harmon for the first time. They're sometimes surprised.
Oh well, you know, I met a lot of people. I ended up prosecuting quite a number of these guys, and I met them, every one of them. And you know, there was some curiosity, some trepidation in the sense that there was one person in particular who was a real sociopath, and you know, I met him. His name was Milan Lukic. Milan Lukic was responsible for some of the worst crimes committed in the former Yugoslavia, some of the cruelest, most barbaric crimes. And, you know, he was, you know, atypical because most of those people weren't from a criminal background. You know, they were military officers by and large. Mm-hmm. You know, when you got into the paramilitaries, they were different. But the career military officers, you know, thought they were doing their jobs and doing it well.
Superior orders.
Yeah, superior orders, and on the other hand, some of their orders were astonishing in how they couldn't make a distinction, because you're not obliged to follow an illegal order. And, there were a lot of illegal orders, and it's surprising how they followed them, relentlessly.
All the trials in the ICTY were held in The Hague, right?
Yes.
None of them were where the crimes occurred, and they weren't.
Correct.
Was that by design early on?
Yeah, I think. Well, there was a war going on when we were created. There was a war. We couldn't have tried the cases in the former Yugoslavia.
Did you worry about it all? Of course, being in Hague's maybe a little bit different, but all about safety. Was this an issue? You guys were you ever targeted? You felt like targeted as a?
It was an issue. It was an issue for the Dutch government. The Dutch government, for the higher-ranking people in the institution, made impeccable security, provisions. I know my house was very, very, very well done in terms of security, alarms and protective glass, etc. There was a worry at the beginning, but I think it diminished as we went on. I remember Sharif Bassioni telling us, he came to the tribunal in probably 94, 95, and he said, I remember him saying this, that, security is not going to be a problem unless you arrest Arkan. And Arkan was a paramilitary leader for the Serbs, and he was a ruthless character, and that's Bassioni's perception was that. I never felt personally, at risk. There was times when I was in the former Yugoslavia when there were issues, but there were great precautions taken to protect us. Generally, I remember just before the Krstić case, we went in. I think it was Andrew Cayley, myself, Pete McCloskey. There may have been Jean-Rene Ruiz, who was the lead investigator, marvelous investigator, by the way. And we wanted to see I wanted to see the crime scenes, every crime scene, because it's basic that you should see. Any lawyer who's going to prosecute a case or defend the case should see the crime scene. You learn a lot. And the crime scenes were divided between the American occupation zone and the Russian zone. And when we went to we were picked up first by the American troops, and the American command took the issue very, very seriously. I remember, we were in SUVs essentially, and then in front of us were two Humvees with 50 caliber machine guns on the front, on the top, and behind us were the same. And we went and then there were 25 fully armed U.S. soldiers in combat kit. And when we went to a scene, they provided a protective perimeter, and, we went out and looked at the scene and, went back in, go to the next scene. When we got passed off to the Russians were in desperate straits. I mean, we met the Russians at the pickup point. There was one armored vehicle. It was a wreck. The soldiers were quite shabby in terms of their appearance. And we followed them, essentially, this one armored vehicle. And as we followed this armored vehicle, we could see the wheel of the rear. It was about to fall off. We got to the first crime scene, and the Russian officer came over to us, and we were in a Toyota Land Cruiser. He says, and this is an 8-wheeled, multi-ton vehicle. He says, do you have a jack we can use to, because they didn't have even a jack to prop up their vehicle. Of course, we had one, but it would not work on a car of that weight.
Sure.
And so they then somehow leveraged this thing up and put firewood, stole firewood from around the neighborhood and jacked it up. And then we had to make a decision whether we were going to proceed without their protection. And we said, we will. We wanted to proceed. And, and nothing happened to us. We went to a location, I remember, we went to all the crime scenes. And in the Russian zone, there was the Branyevo military farm. I talked about that today. There was the Pilica Cultural Dome. I talked about that today. That's where, on the 16th of July, there were massacres of probably close to 1,800 people in 2 locations. And I remember walking. We looked at the Branyevo military farm, and then we repaired over to the Pilica Cultural Dome, and there was a cafe that was across the street where a critical witness by the name of Dražan Ardemovich sat. He refused to participate in the massacre of 500 people there, but he sat and he told us about being in that cafe and hearing the shooting inside. Occasionally somebody would come out, get killed. And he saw that, he related that story to us. So we drove up to that cafe. And I'll never forget that. It wasn't difficult to figure out who we were. We had these white UN vehicles. We pull up to the cafe. We walk into the cafe. I walked into the cafe with my friends, my colleagues, and nobody said a word. Now, what was remarkable about the Srebrenica case, from a humane point of view, is I did that case for years in the investigation and the trial. In the course of those years, there were a total of 2 witnesses who, from the Bosnian Serb side, who came to us voluntarily and told us. One was Dražan Ardemovich, I discussed today, who had been shot 3 times by the people in the execution squad, and the other was a guy who was morally outraged by what he had seen, and he came to us. So when I walked into that cafe, there were a fair number of patrons in that cafe, and knowing who we were, one would have expected, I would have expected in normal circumstances, these were not normal circumstances, I would have expected somebody to say to me, "You're here investigating what happened across the street? Let me tell you, I was here. Let me tell you what happened." That didn't happen. And it was because there was such a climate of fear, and there was such denial about Srebrenica. The tribunal was the enemy, and anybody probably in the minds of those people, collaborating with us, would have had consequences. Yeah. But nevertheless, I know of only 2 people. And these massacres were not committed some were in remote locations, but others, the Pilica Cultural Dome, was on the main highway going up to Zvornik. Yeah. So and when they were busing these people to the execution sites, these people traveled in buses, through, on public roads, through public towns and villages. People knew what happened. They were too afraid to talk about it. Yeah.
Now that you've concluded, well, I shouldn't say concluded, but now you're done with your work at the ECCC, what's next?
Fly fishing.
Sorry?
No, I'm gonna stay home for a little while. And, I still think I can contribute, so I'm happy to be of assistance where I can be of assistance. But it'll have to be from home.
Observation, and again, I'm not of this world, so it's just a commercial lawyer's observation, and having just tremendous respect for the law that you and your colleagues have done. Because the tribunals are winding down, you heard about this, legacy courts and residual courts and all these terms that are being used. And at the same time, we have lots of students here today. From Washington University, Case, Syracuse, Vanderbilt, all those who are in the international, and also pretty starry-eyed about the stories they're hearing, and they feel good and they want to make a difference. Where do they go? What do they do?
Well, I think there's a future in international criminal law, but I think there's a challenge as well. The challenge is to get it right, to find the right models that work. It doesn't have to be a single model, but there could be different models that work. Look, in my view, the project is still in its infancy, and there are a lot of people who do not want it to succeed, and so they're willing to point out the failures, and it's not too hard, willing to point out the failures of international criminal justice in these tribunals. But, you know, as with every important endeavor, 22 years, 23 years is not a very long time.
No.
And, you know, and so it's important that these institutions succeed. If they succeed, then there will be a future for these young students. But if they fail, and they can fail for any number of reasons, insufficient funding, you know, the voluntary funding model, as was mentioned today in the conference, in my view, is a disaster. You need a stable set of funding, and you know, and then institutions can succeed if they are properly financed. You know, there are expectations. We've heard throughout this conference, managing expectations. Expectations of the creators of these institutions are hurry up and finish, essentially. With any criminal investigation, you know, you need to take your time, you know, do it as fast as you can, obviously, but as carefully and as meticulously as you can. But you have to develop evidence. You can't adopt the popular narrative and think that's sufficient to go into court, you know. So you have to develop the evidence, and it takes time to develop evidence, and these cases are difficult. I read a law review article, probably written in about 2008. I don't remember the author, but he was talking about the Oklahoma City bombing, a domestic terrorist case that cost 168 lives in Oklahoma City. And that case, the first year, according to the author, who relied on Department of Justice statistics, said there were over 3,000 FBI agents assigned to that case. And then it went through the history of that case, and every year they diminished. But when you think of international criminal justice, and let's talk about the Srebrenica case. The Srebrenica case was by far the best investigated case that I ever was involved in, and probably in the institution. There was a lot of interest to help us do the investigation. So the United States gave us aerial imagery. There were countries that donated the services of forensic experts, for example. But how many actual investigators were involved? Let's take the Oklahoma City bombing case. If the author is correct, and there were 3,000 FBI agents for a single incident with 168 deaths, and we look at Srebrenica with, you know, a series of days where these atrocities were committed, and there were approximately 8,000, you know, murdered boys and men. You know how many investigators we had? 5.
Wow.
At the top. That is according to, you know, I asked Jean-Rene Ruiz that question. I said, what was, at the high water mark, how many investigators do we have? He said 5. Oh. Now, you know, that's pretty tough. If you're given a mandate to investigate, you know, these large-scale crimes, then you need to have the resources to do that. And if you don't have those resources, these institutions will fail. And if they fail, the dream of achieving the end of impunity will fail. There'll be no courts to hold these people accountable, and these young students will not have employment in the future.
It's an interesting challenge for law schools, is to kind of look in that crystal ball and see what's next, because they certainly provided feeders. A lot of these law schools are feeders to research for these tribunals, and they're having a chance today to meet those people who are the head of those tribunals, but to be more on a historical basis rather than an active court basis.
Well, they want it to be. They want to step into our shoes,
Yeah.
and they should. Frankly, they should.
Yeah.
But the world has to appreciate the value of ending impunity in these institutions, and that means they have to finance them properly.
And that's a challenge. I'm so thrilled we're here. This is terrific. You've been an active participant, Mark, in the Jackson Center. I should ask you, was you going to law school and Department of Justice? What did Jackson, was he part of your world at all, just as other than a name?
He was a name
Yeah.
then. I read considerably about the Holocaust because it interested me, but I knew about the Nuremberg trials, but there was no hope that that would ever be resurrected when I was going to law school.
Right, right.
So I didn't, ever think about it. Therefore, when the opportunity came, I jumped at the chance.
Well, God bless you, because it is, as Josh was saying, it's God's work, So thank you. Thanks for coming. Enjoy.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciated being here.
Yeah, it's great. It was fun last night too.
Okay.